Long before the first cities rose or words were written on clay, humanity lived in a world of raw wilderness and wonder, a world shaped by stone, bone, and fire. The Stone Age was not merely a distant chapter of prehistory. It was the crucible in which the essence of human civilization was formed. In that vast expanse of time, stretching over millions of years, our ancestors learned to survive the merciless rhythms of nature, to craft tools from the earth beneath their feet, to speak, to dream, and to imagine. Each chipped flint and painted cave wall tells the story of a species awakening. Slowly, painfully, triumphantly, to its own potential. The Stone Age was an age of beginnings, of art and thought, of community and belief, of the first fragile sparks of knowledge that would one day ignite the fires of civilization. To journey back to that age is to walk beside the first humans as they discovered what it meant to be human. During the Paleolithic Age, the dawn of humankind unfolded across vast stretches of time and landscape. It was an age that witnessed not merely the creation of tools or the mastery of fire, but the gradual emergence of human awareness itself. A long, slow awakening of a species that would one day come to dominate the earth. The earliest humans, known to us through scattered bones and fragments of stone, marked the beginning of a story that would stretch for millions of years. Among them, three figures stand out: Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and Homo sapiens. Each represented a step in the unfolding of human potential, a bridge between the instinct-driven existence of early primates and the complex, symbolic life of modern people. The first of these, Homo habilis, appeared in Africa roughly 2.6 million years ago. Their name, meaning handyman, was given because they were the earliest known makers of tools. These tools were simple: flakes chipped from larger stones, or rough cores used to cut meat or crack bones, but they were revolutionary. For the first time, a creature had learned to shape the world rather than simply adapt to it. Fossils found in the Great Rift Valley of East Africa, at sites like Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, show that Homo habilis was smaller and more ape-like than modern humans, standing little more than 1.5 meters tall, with long arms and a relatively small brain. Yet within that small brain lay the beginnings of ingenuity. The making of tools was not random. It showed planning, skill, and learning passed between generations. These early humans lived in small bands, surviving by scavenging and opportunistic hunting. They likely did not yet master fire, nor build shelters as their descendants would, but they had begun to alter their environment in small but significant ways. Bones with cut marks tell us that they were able to strip flesh from carcasses, gaining more nutrition than other scavengers. Over countless generations, the use of tools shaped their hands, their brains, and perhaps even their societies. In shaping stone, Homo habilis began to shape itself. From this foundation emerged Homo erectus, a more advanced and enduring species that appeared around 1.9 million years ago. Taller, stronger, and with a brain nearly twice the size of its predecessor, Homo erectus was the first human ancestor to truly walk upright in the modern sense. Its long legs and shorter arms suited for striding across open plains. With this new body came new possibilities. Homo erectus spread far beyond Africa, moving into Asia and Europe, adapting to different climates and landscapes. Fossils found in places such as Java and China show that this species was the first to leave the cradle of Africa and inhabit much of the Old World. It was Homo erectus who learned to master fire, an achievement that transformed human existence. Fire brought warmth against cold nights, protection from predators, and a new means of preparing food. Cooked meat and plants were easier to digest, allowing more energy to nourish their growing brains. The flickering light of a campfire also offered something less tangible but equally profound: a space for social life. Around those early fires, groups could gather, share food, and perhaps begin to form the roots of language. The tools of Homo erectus became more refined, too. The hand axe, a teardrop-shaped stone carefully chipped on both sides, appeared during this time. It was a versatile tool, used for cutting, digging, and scraping, and it remained virtually unchanged for hundreds of thousands of years, a testament to its effectiveness. Such tools suggest a growing intelligence and sense of design, an understanding of symmetry and purpose that foreshadowed the artistry of later humans. Over time, Homo erectus gave rise to several related human species, each adapting to its environment. In Europe, Homo heidelbergensis and later Homo neanderthalensis evolved. In Africa, the lineage that would become Homo sapiens continued to refine its abilities. By around 300,000 years ago, the first anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, appeared in Africa. They were physically similar to us, with high foreheads, rounded skulls, and lighter skeletal frames. But what truly set them apart was the emergence of symbolic thought and culture. Homo sapiens were the first to create art, to bury their dead with care, and to imagine things that did not yet exist. Cave paintings in sites such as Lascaux and Altamira, though dating much later, are echoes of this mental revolution. They reveal a mind capable of abstraction, of expressing fear, hope, and wonder through image and symbol. Language, though invisible in the archaeological record, must have flourished by this time, allowing for the sharing of knowledge across generations and distances. With language came storytelling, cooperation, and the creation of myths, elements that would define human societies forever after. These early humans lived in a world that was harsh but full of opportunity. They hunted with spears, gathered fruits and roots, and followed the great herds across open savannas. Their lives were bound to the rhythms of nature, yet they were no longer merely part of it. They had begun to stand apart, to observe, to plan, and to change it. By the end of the Paleolithic period, Homo sapiens had spread to every continent except Antarctica, adapting to deserts, forests, and frozen tundra. They made clothes from animal skins, built shelters, and organized themselves into complex social groups. In this long stretch of time, from Homo habilis to Homo sapiens, humanity took its first great steps. The making of tools, the taming of fire, the development of language and community. Each was a moment of transformation. The Paleolithic Age was not simply a prehistoric chapter of survival. It was the crucible in which human identity was forged. Every stone flake, every firelit night, every step across an unknown land was part of a journey that led, eventually, to the world we know today. Life during the Paleolithic Age was defined by movement, by the unending rhythm of seeking and surviving. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived as hunter-gatherers, shaping their existence around the cycles of nature. There were no farms, no permanent houses, no cities or nations. Only the open world, raw and immense, and the small bands of people who traversed it in search of food and shelter. Theirs was a life both fragile and free, bounded by necessity yet sustained by a deep knowledge of the land. The hunter-gatherers of the Paleolithic age depended entirely on the natural world. They took what the earth, rivers, and forests offered. The meat of animals, the fruits of trees, the roots hidden beneath the soil, the fish in the streams, and the honey gathered from wild bees. Survival required skill and constant awareness. People learned to read the landscape as a book written in tracks and scents, to know the habits of animals and the seasons of plants. Every member of the group had a role to play. Men often hunted large game, mammoths, bison, deer, or wild cattle, using stone-tipped spears, bows, and traps, though women and children also hunted smaller creatures and gathered much of the daily food supply. Women's work in collecting berries, nuts, seeds, and edible plants likely provided the majority of the group's sustenance. A reminder that the foundations of human life were as much gathered as they were hunted. The constant need for food shaped the social organization of early humans. They lived in small, mobile groups, perhaps 20 to 40 individuals, linked by kinship and cooperation. These bands would travel together across wide territories, following migrating herds or the ripening of fruits and grains. When resources in one area were exhausted, they moved on to another. This mobility kept them in balance with nature but also demanded adaptability. A band that could not move quickly, or that lost its skill in reading the land, would perish. There were no stores to rely on, no surplus to save for hard times. Food was consumed as it was found, and every day brought a new search. Within these groups, the bonds of cooperation were vital. Hunting large animals was dangerous work that required coordination, patience, and trust. Some would drive the herd toward an ambush. Others would lie in wait, spears poised. Communication through gesture, sound, and eventually language was essential. Success meant not only food but also safety and social stability. After a hunt, the meat was shared among all members of the group, not hoarded. Sharing reinforced loyalty and ensured survival during lean times. It was this cooperative spirit, rooted in the demands of hunting and gathering, that laid the foundation for human society. The rhythm of hunter-gatherer life was guided by the seasons. In summer and spring, people might move toward rivers or coastlines where fish were abundant and plants plentiful. In colder months, they sought shelter in caves, forests, or natural depressions, using fire to keep warm. They learned to make temporary shelters from branches, skins, and bones, structures that could be assembled and abandoned with ease. Over generations, they developed an intimate understanding of weather, stars, and animal migrations. This deep ecological knowledge, passed down through storytelling and imitation, was as vital as any tool they carried. The tools of Paleolithic hunter-gatherers evolved with their needs. Early on, crude stone flakes served for cutting and scraping, but over time humans developed a remarkable diversity of implements. Finely chipped blades, pointed spears, bone needles, fishing hooks, and later bows and arrows. These innovations reflected a growing mastery over the environment. Yet for all their skill, Paleolithic people remained deeply dependent on the world around them. They could not control the weather, the migration of animals, or the sudden changes that could devastate their food supply. Periods of abundance alternated with famine. Life was precarious, and death was a constant companion. Despite this harshness, their lives were not devoid of meaning or joy. Archaeological evidence suggests that Paleolithic people created art, music, and ritual. The magnificent cave paintings of Lascaux and Chauvet, though produced in later millennia, echo a sensibility that must have begun in the minds of hunter-gatherers long before. They saw the animals they hunted not merely as food but as powerful beings, intertwined with the rhythms of existence. Some scholars believe that hunting was accompanied by rituals meant to honor or appease these creatures, gestures of respect toward the forces that sustained life. In the world of the hunter-gatherer, there was no sharp division between the practical and the spiritual. The environment was alive with meaning. Every river, tree, and stone could hold significance. The hunter-gatherer's awareness was shaped by closeness to nature and by constant motion through it. They were not separate from the landscape. They were part of it, bound to its cycles. Theirs was a way of life that shaped our bodies, our minds, and our social instincts. Every tool we wield, every meal we share, every story we tell around a fire traces its ancestry to those distant ancestors who walked the earth in search of food, following the call of the seasons and the promise of the hunt. The making of stone tools stands among the greatest achievements of the Paleolithic age, a quiet yet revolutionary act that marked the threshold between animal instinct and human intellect. Before the shaping of stone, our ancestors lived much like other creatures, relying on their bodies and their wits to survive. But with the first deliberate strike of one rock against another, they began to change the world around them. That act, repeated and refined over millions of years, gave rise to a technology that would define human evolution: the ability to craft and use tools with purpose. The earliest known tools date back about 2.6 million years, found in the ancient beds of the Great Rift Valley in East Africa. These first implements were simple flakes, broken off from larger stones by sharp blows. The maker, perhaps Homo habilis, had discovered that a stone could be fractured in a predictable way, producing an edge capable of cutting flesh, scraping hide, or cracking bone. These tools, known today as the Oldowan industry, were crude in form but profound in implication. They signaled the dawn of a new kind of thinking, a capacity for planning, for imagining a result before it was achieved, and for shaping nature to fit human intention. To understand the significance of these early tools, one must imagine the world as it was then. Vast plains filled with great beasts, scattered trees offering uncertain shade, and small groups of humans struggling to survive amid predators far stronger and faster than themselves. The stone tool was both a weapon and a promise. With it, humans could slice meat from carcasses left behind by lions or hyenas, extract the marrow from bones, and cut plant fibers for shelter or cordage. It extended the hand and the mind alike, transforming raw materials into instruments of survival. Each tool carried within it the story of a mind that had learned not merely to use what nature offered but to remake it. Over countless generations, the crafting of tools became more refined. By around 1.8 million years ago, Homo erectus had developed a more sophisticated technology known as the Acheulean industry. Its hallmark was the hand axe, a carefully shaped, symmetrical tool flaked on both sides to produce a sharp edge around a teardrop form. Unlike the irregular stones of earlier times, the hand axe revealed something new: design. Its maker had not only struck the stone for utility but had imagined its final shape, balancing beauty with function. These axes served many purposes: cutting meat, chopping wood, digging roots, even shaping other tools. They were the Swiss Army knives of the prehistoric world, durable and versatile, and their manufacture required both patience and skill. The creation of such tools was not an act of brute force. It demanded a deep understanding of stone, of its grain and fracture, of the angle and pressure needed to split it cleanly. The toolmaker's craft was a form of early science, an art of observation and precision honed by endless repetition. Those who could make better tools likely gained status within their groups. Their skill meant better hunting, more food, and greater safety. Thus, the knowledge of stoneworking became a core part of human culture, passed down from one generation to the next, preserved not by writing but by demonstration and memory. As humans spread beyond Africa into Europe and Asia, their tools adapted to new environments. In colder climates, stone knives and scrapers became essential for preparing animal hides into clothing. Spears tipped with sharpened stone allowed hunters to strike from a distance, reducing the risk of injury from large prey. Each innovation reflected not only the demands of survival but the growing flexibility of the human mind. Where nature presented obstacles, humans answered with invention. By the later Paleolithic, the evolution of tools had reached remarkable levels of complexity. The Mousterian industry, associated with Neanderthals, produced finely shaped flakes, points, and scrapers, often designed for specific tasks. The Levallois technique, a method of preparing a stone core so that flakes of predetermined shape could be struck from it, demonstrated advanced planning and abstract reasoning. Such craftsmanship shows that toolmaking had become more than a reaction to immediate need. It was an intellectual pursuit, a form of problem-solving that foreshadowed the logic of later human technology. Eventually, Homo sapiens carried the tradition still further. They began to create composite tools, joining stone points to wooden shafts with sinew and resin, and later crafting delicate blades, burins, and needles. Stone, once a crude implement, had become part of a larger system of technology that included bone, antler, and wood. These tools allowed early humans to hunt more efficiently, to build shelters, to make clothing, and to carve objects of art. The same hands that chipped flint also etched lines into bone and painted shapes on cave walls, suggesting that the creative impulse that gave rise to tools also stirred the beginnings of symbolic thought. The making and use of tools had profound effects on the course of human evolution. The act of toolmaking strengthened the hand and refined motor skills, while the demands of planning and cooperation expanded the brain. Fire, later harnessed and maintained, worked in tandem with stone technology to open new ways of living. Cooked food provided more energy, and cutting tools made it easier to prepare. The tool thus became an extension of the body, a prosthetic of thought, linking the physical and the mental in a single gesture. There is something deeply human in the image of a Paleolithic toolmaker, sitting beside a riverbank, surrounded by shards of stone. Each blow of the hammerstone rings with intention. Each flake that falls brings the tool closer to perfection. The process is repetitive yet meditative, an early dialogue between mind and material. Through this craft, humans learn to foresee, to adapt, and to create not only objects but possibilities. By the end of the Paleolithic age, stone tools had accompanied humanity across continents and through ages of ice and fire. Though later ages would bring bronze and iron, the foundations of technology were laid in those distant millennia when a creature with clever hands learned to shape a stone into something more than itself. In that simple act, the world changed forever. From it arose all that would follow: the arts of building, of warfare, of science, and of civilization. The first spark of human mastery lay not in metal or machine, but in the flint struck by an ancient hand, a fragment of stone that carried within it the birth of human ingenuity. The discovery of fire stands as one of the most transformative moments in the history of humankind. It was not merely the taming of a natural force, but the awakening of an enduring alliance between humanity and the elements. For early humans of the Paleolithic age, fire was at once a mystery, a danger, and a gift, a power drawn from lightning, volcano, or the spark of stone, and then held, tended, and made their own. It altered the rhythms of life, reshaped the human body and mind, and became the first true technology of civilization. Long before people learned to make fire at will, they encountered it in its wild form. Flames leaping from dry grass after a storm, the glowing mouth of a forest blaze, or the slow burn of a tree struck by lightning. At first, fire must have inspired both awe and terror. Its heat and light, its ability to destroy as easily as to illuminate, would have made it seem alive, perhaps even divine. Yet in time, the first humans learned not only to fear it but to harness it. The earliest evidence of controlled fire dates back hundreds of thousands of years. Ash deposits, charred bones, and hearths discovered in ancient caves and open-air camps from Africa to Eurasia. These faint traces tell of a species that had begun to draw warmth and life from what had once been only destruction. To control fire was to seize a piece of the sun. For the first time, humans could push back against the cold and the dark. Nights that had once been filled with predators and uncertainty became times of safety and community. The glow of a fire drove away beasts whose eyes glimmered beyond the circle of light. Flames guarded the entrances of caves, and smoke deterred insects. In colder climates, fire meant survival itself, allowing people to endure harsh winters and expand into new regions of the world that would otherwise have been uninhabitable. Heat from the hearth extended human presence far beyond the tropical cradle of Africa, into the chill of Europe and the highlands of Asia. Cooking was another revolution born of fire. Before its discovery, humans ate raw meat, roots, and fruits, limited by what could be torn, crushed, or chewed. But when food met flame, it was transformed. Meat softened, grains and tubers became edible, and pathogens were destroyed. Cooked food yielded more energy with less effort, feeding the growing brain that defined the human species. This change, subtle in its beginnings, may have been decisive in human evolution. Those who cooked ate better, lived longer, and could support larger groups. The hearth thus became not only a center of warmth but of nourishment and innovation. Around the fire, social life deepened. The flickering light extended the day, creating time beyond the demands of hunting and gathering. People could now sit together and speak, share stories, and plan for the future. In that circle of light, language may have grown richer, thought more reflective. The fire's glow illuminated faces, gestures, and eyes, an intimacy that no other species knew. It offered the first setting for storytelling, for ritual, for the transmission of memory from one generation to the next. In this sense, the hearth was the earliest classroom, the first stage, the original temple. To maintain fire was a task of both skill and vigilance. Could not be taken for granted. A flame had to be kept alive, protected from wind and rain, carried from one camp to the next. The knowledge of firekeeping became sacred, entrusted to those who understood its moods. Eventually, humans discovered how to kindle it anew, striking sparks from flint and pyrite or rubbing wood until friction gave birth to smoke and flame. This mastery turned fire from a rare accident into a constant companion. Every spark represented not only survival but the triumph of mind over matter. The presence of fire also began to change the landscape itself. Hunter-gatherers used it deliberately to shape their environment, burning grasslands to drive game or to encourage the growth of fresh vegetation. Forests and plains were subtly reshaped by human intention, and for the first time, people became agents of ecological transformation. This was the beginning of humanity's long and uneasy partnership with the natural world, a relationship in which control and dependence would forever be intertwined. The spiritual dimension of fire ran deep. To Paleolithic people, it was more than a tool. It was a symbol of life and mystery. The dual nature of fire, its power to warm or to destroy, must have inspired early myths and rituals. Archaeological traces of hearths within caves, surrounded by art and bones, suggest that fire played a role in ceremonies and beliefs. The dancing flames perhaps mirrored the unseen forces of existence, representing both creation and renewal. The fire that cooked food and guarded the night might also have been seen as the breath of ancestors or the heart of the earth itself. Firelight also changed how humans saw themselves. It revealed their own shadows, cast large and flickering on cave walls, transforming ordinary beings into mythic shapes. In this glowing theater, imagination was born. The same fire that roasted meat may have inspired the first artists to draw bison and horses across stone, their lines moving like living things in the shifting light. Thus, the mastery of fire not only fed the body but also ignited the mind. By the later Paleolithic period, fire had become inseparable from human life. Every camp had its hearth, every group its keepers of flame. It marked the center of the dwelling, the heart of the community. From its warmth came sustenance, from its light came vision, and from its danger came respect. Fire was humanity's first true technology, an energy captured and controlled, an element transformed into ally. Deep within the silent darkness of ancient caves, long before words were written or civilizations rose, human beings began to leave behind signs of their minds, images etched and painted on stone. These early works, born in the Paleolithic age tens of thousands of years ago, mark one of the most profound moments in human history, the awakening of art, symbol, and imagination. They are not merely decorations but testimonies of thought, belief, and expression, evidence that humanity had crossed from instinct into reflection. The origins of cave art reach back at least 40,000 years, though some findings suggest even earlier stirrings of creativity. The caves of Lascaux in France, Altamira in Spain, and Chauvet in the Ardèche Valley remain among the most striking examples, their walls alive with herds of bison, horses, mammoths, and deer. These paintings were made not by primitive hands fumbling in ignorance but by artists with remarkable skill, sensitivity, and purpose, using natural pigments, iron oxide for red, charcoal for black, ochre and manganese for yellow and brown. They created vivid, enduring images that have outlasted their makers by millennia. The act of painting inside a cave was no casual endeavor. The artists ventured deep underground, carrying torches or stone lamps filled with animal fat, their flickering flames illuminating the rough contours of the rock. They used the natural curves of the walls to give shape to their creatures, turning bulges and hollows into the muscles and shadows of living forms. Some figures were painted high above the floor, suggesting the use of scaffolding or ladders. The process required planning, cooperation, and an understanding of materials, qualities that reveal not savagery but sophistication. The question of why these early humans created art has stirred centuries of debate. Some scholars have viewed the paintings as part of hunting magic, intended to ensure success in the chase or to pay homage to the spirits of the animals they depended on. Others see them as expressions of myth and ritual, perhaps connected to initiation ceremonies or shamanic visions. The caves themselves may have been considered sacred spaces, gateways between the human world and the realm of spirits or ancestors. Whatever their exact meaning, the art of the Paleolithic was never idle. It carried significance, shaped by a worldview in which nature, animal, and human were bound in a single web of existence. The animals depicted are rendered with astonishing vitality. Herds surge across the walls, their legs overlapping in motion, their bodies powerful and dynamic. Bison toss their heads, horses gallop, reindeer turn to face unseen threats. Yet humans themselves appear rarely, and when they do, they are stylized or abstract, often masked or combined with animal features. This suggests a worldview in which animals held sacred importance, perhaps seen as equals, ancestors, or divine messengers. The artist's role may have been less that of an observer than of a participant in a larger spiritual drama. Carvings and engravings, too, played a role in this emerging symbolic language. Stones, bones, and pieces of ivory were incised with lines, patterns, and figures. Some were small enough to carry personal tokens of identity or belief. Others may have served as early attempts at notation, recording events, seasons, or rituals. The famous Venus figurines, found across Europe and dating back more than 25,000 years, depict exaggerated female forms, often with large breasts and hips, but little detail of face or limb. They may have represented fertility, motherhood, or the Earth's abundance, embodiments of life and continuity in a harsh and uncertain world. These works of art also reveal something intimate about the human condition. They show that early humans were not solely occupied with survival. They had time and imagination to dream, to symbolize, to make meaning beyond the immediate struggle for food and safety. In the darkness of the caves, surrounded by flickering light and echoing sound, they transformed fear and wonder into image. This act of creation was a way of mastering the unknown, of giving shape to thoughts that could not yet be spoken. The use of color, perspective, and motion in Paleolithic art speaks to a sophisticated visual intelligence. Some scenes suggest narrative, the chase, the dance, the hunt, while others are layered, as if the same wall were used by many generations, each adding to a growing story. Handprints, made by blowing pigment through hollow bones against the wall, appear like signatures or marks of presence. I was here. Some are small, belonging to women or children, suggesting that the making of art was a shared human experience, not the domain of any single group or gender. Art also served as communication, though not in the simple sense of transmitting messages. Rather, it connected the living with each other and with their environment. Through shared symbols, early humans could express identity, belonging, and belief. The act of painting itself may have been communal, a ritual in which sound, movement, and image merged. In some caves, echoes play strange tricks with the human voice, suggesting that sound was part of the experience. The artists may have sung, chanted, or drummed as they painted, the rhythm of creation intertwined with the rhythm of life. To stand today before these ancient images is to feel the presence of minds reaching across vast time. The artists who made them lived in a world that was cold, dangerous, and uncertain. Yet their art breathes with vitality and grace. Their lines are confident, their colors deliberate. They understood motion, anatomy, and beauty. In their work, one sees not only survival but imagination, the spark that would lead, tens of millennia later, to writing, religion, and civilization. In the vast expanse of the Paleolithic world, long before the rise of kingdoms or cities, human life unfolded in small, close-knit groups. These early societies, bands or tribes rarely numbering more than a few dozen individuals, were the first frameworks of cooperation and belonging. They formed not from conquest or ambition but from necessity. In a world ruled by the rhythms of nature and the dangers of the wild, survival depended on unity. Within these groups, the foundations of human social life were laid. Sharing, communication, mutual care, and the delicate balance between individual freedom and communal need. The landscape of the Paleolithic age was immense and often unforgiving. Food was not produced but found, hunted, gathered, scavenged, and the success of each day's search was uncertain. In such conditions, solitary existence was nearly impossible. To hunt large animals, to defend against predators, to care for the young and the sick, all required collective effort. Thus, small bands of families and kin emerged, bound together by trust, shared labor, and the fragile threads of kinship. These were the earliest human communities, moving through forests, plains, and river valleys in rhythm with the seasons and the migrations of game. Life within these groups was deeply cooperative. Food, when obtained, was shared among all. A successful hunter might bring down an animal, but the kill belonged to the group, not to the individual. This practice of sharing was not generosity in the modern sense, it was survival strategy. In an unpredictable world, hoarding could doom the group, while sharing ensured that everyone endured. Such cooperation fostered social bonds stronger than any law or ruler. It also created a moral order, an early sense of justice and responsibility that guided human behavior long before the first written codes. Each group likely consisted of extended families, perhaps 20 to 40 people, moving together within a territory they knew intimately. Leadership, where it existed, was informal. Authority rested not in domination but in experience. The wisdom of elders, the skill of hunters, the knowledge of those who understood the signs of weather or the paths of animals. Decisions were likely made collectively, through discussion and consensus, reflecting the equality born of necessity. There were no kings or warriors, no permanent hierarchies. The Paleolithic world was one of balance, where the strength of the group depended on the contributions of all. Within these bands, roles began to form according to age, skill, and need. Women often gathered plants, fruits, seeds, and roots, providing a steady supply of food. Men frequently hunted or explored, though these boundaries were flexible and varied by region. Children learned by imitation, observing the movements and habits of their elders. Knowledge was transmitted not through written language but through practice, story, and ritual. The making of tools, the recognition of plants, the tracking of animals. Each skill was a shared inheritance, passed on around the fires that lit the night. Fire itself became a social center. Around it, people gathered for warmth, protection, and conversation. It was here that the tribe became something more than a collection of individuals. It became a community of memory and imagination. Stories were told, experiences recounted, and lessons taught. Through storytelling, the group preserved its identity and its wisdom. Myths and beliefs likely grew from these gatherings, shaping the first sense of shared meaning. The firelight illuminated faces, gestures, and laughter, binding people together through the simple, ancient act of togetherness. The emotional depth of these relationships cannot be overstated. Life was precarious, and death was a constant companion. Bonds within the group were therefore intense, ties of affection, loyalty, and grief that shaped human consciousness. Archaeological evidence of careful burials, with bodies arranged and accompanied by objects or pigments, suggests that Paleolithic people mourned their dead. Such acts reveal an awareness of loss and continuity, an understanding that the group was larger than the moment, that its members lived on in memory and tradition. Conflict, when it occurred, was likely limited. With small numbers and vast open spaces, groups could move away from each other rather than engage in prolonged fighting. Cooperation and avoidance were often wiser than confrontation. Yet contact between groups was inevitable, and these encounters could bring both danger and opportunity. Exchanges of tools, pigments, or ornaments may have occurred. Early forms of trade and cultural contact. Marriages between groups would have strengthened genetic diversity and social alliances. From these interactions grew the first networks of communication that spanned landscapes and generations. Language itself, though invisible in the archaeological record, must have flourished within these groups. The demands of cooperation, hunting together, teaching children, planning migrations, would have driven the evolution of speech. Words allowed people to share knowledge beyond gesture or mimicry, to express emotion, to persuade and warn. The spoken language of the Paleolithic tribes was likely rich in nuance and rhythm, a living thread that connected minds. Through it, the group became not just a biological unit but a social organism, bound by shared meaning. Over time, as human populations grew and spread, these small bands evolved into more complex communities. But the essential structure of human society, the need for cooperation, the sense of belonging, the tension between self and group was already established. The Paleolithic tribe was the first mirror in which humanity saw itself reflected as both individual and collective. It was within these early gatherings that love, friendship, jealousy, and justice first found form, shaping the emotional vocabulary that still defines us. Even in their simplicity, these groups possessed a kind of wisdom. They lived lightly on the earth, taking only what was needed, moving with the seasons, leaving few traces but their tools, their art, and their bones. They depended utterly on one another, yet they were free from the rigid hierarchies that would later dominate human life. Theirs was a society woven from shared effort and mutual reliance, a fragile equilibrium between cooperation and independence that allowed the species to endure through unimaginable spans of time. When one imagines those early bands, small clusters of people gathered beneath the stars, their fire flickering against the dark, their voices mingling with the sounds of night, it becomes clear that the roots of humanity lie not in isolation but in companionship. The tribe was the first human home, a circle of faces, a web of memory and care, bound together against the vastness of the world. In their unity, fragile yet enduring, the first chapters of human society were written, not on stone or parchment, but in the living bonds between people who learned that to survive, they must belong. As the last great ice age drew to its end, the Earth entered a time of profound transformation. The frozen dominions that had gripped the northern continents for tens of thousands of years began to thaw, and with that thaw came a slow, relentless reshaping of the world and of human life. The Mesolithic Age, bridging the long span between the Paleolithic and the Neolithic, unfolded within this era of change. A time when glaciers retreated, rivers broke free of their icy bonds, and the air grew warmer, gentler, and more generous. It was a moment when the world awakened from its frozen sleep, and humankind, too, began to adapt to new rhythms of life. The change was neither sudden nor uniform. Over millennia, vast ice sheets that had blanketed northern Europe, Asia, and North America melted, their waters flooding valleys and carving new lakes and seas. In the wake of the retreating glaciers, landscapes once barren and lifeless bloomed with grasses, shrubs, and trees. Tundra gave way to forest, and the great cold steppes became meadows rich with life. Birch and pine were followed by oak, hazel, and elm. The gray expanse of ice was replaced by a mosaic of green and gold. With this transformation, the animal world shifted as well. The mighty mammoth, the woolly rhinoceros, and other beasts of the Ice Age faded into extinction, while new species, red deer, wild boar, aurochs, and smaller game, thrived in the forests and valleys. For humans, these changes demanded adaptation. The old ways of life, built around the pursuit of large herds across open plains, no longer sufficed in a world of woodlands and rivers. The hunter-gatherers of the Mesolithic Age learned to live differently. Their tools became finer, more versatile. The great spearheads of the Paleolithic were replaced by microliths, tiny, sharp blades of stone, often set into wooden shafts to form arrows, barbs, and fishing gear. These delicate instruments reflected both ingenuity and necessity. Hunting in dense forest required precision, not power, patience, not speed. The new environment rewarded subtlety and skill. The changing climate also reshaped human movement and settlement. Where once people had roamed vast distances in pursuit of herds, they now began to occupy smaller, more stable territories, rich in varied resources. Forests provided wood for tools and shelters, rivers and lakes offered fish and waterfowl, and the growing abundance of nuts, berries, and grains added diversity to the diet. Seasonal camps became common, as groups moved between the shore, the river, and the woodland in harmony with nature's cycles. The rhythm of life grew more intricate and local. The end of the Ice Age also brought rising seas. As the ice melted, coastlines transformed dramatically. Land bridges that once connected continents disappeared beneath the waves. Britain, once joined to mainland Europe, became an island. The Mediterranean spread, reshaping the coasts of southern Europe and North Africa. New islands were born, and ancient valleys were swallowed by water. These changes forced human communities to adapt again, altering their routes of migration, their hunting grounds, and their sense of the world's boundaries. Yet, in these shifting landscapes, new opportunities arose. Fishing and shell gathering became central to survival in many regions, and people built boats and rafts to navigate the waters that had once been ice. This period of transition demanded more than physical adaptation. It required a change in perception. The earth was no longer a frozen wilderness to be endured. It was becoming a living, fertile world to be understood and managed. Humans began to observe the patterns of growth and renewal that governed their surroundings. They noticed that plants sprouted, ripened, and withered in predictable cycles, that animals returned to the same places at the same times each year. This growing awareness of nature's rhythms laid the groundwork for the greatest revolution of all, the shift toward agriculture that would later define the Neolithic Age. But for now, in the Mesolithic, humanity remained suspended between old and new, between the nomadic past and the settled future. The warmer climate also influenced human culture in less tangible ways. The security of abundant resources allowed for a richer social life and perhaps a deeper sense of place. Archaeological evidence suggests that Mesolithic people buried their dead with care, decorated objects with geometric designs, and carved figures from bone and antler. Such expressions hint at a consciousness expanding beyond mere survival, a contemplation of beauty, memory, and meaning. The landscape itself became a source of identity, a living tapestry woven with sacred groves, river crossings, and hunting grounds. Yet the New World was not without its perils. As forests spread, predators such as wolves and bears flourished. Diseases transmitted by warmer climates and denser populations likely became more common. Floods and changing coastlines could destroy familiar territories. To live in this era was to exist in flux, to adapt constantly to the restless evolution of the earth. But adaptability had long been humanity's greatest strength, and the Mesolithic peoples mastered it with remarkable resilience. In this time of transformation, fire remained a constant ally. It cleared forests for hunting, kept insects at bay, and offered warmth through the unpredictable seasons. Its controlled use allowed humans to shape their environment deliberately for the first time. Some groups even practiced small-scale burning of vegetation to encourage the growth of certain plants or to drive game, a primitive form of environmental management that foreshadowed the domestication of nature yet to come. The Mesolithic world was a place of balance, between ice and warmth, wilderness and cultivation, tradition and innovation. Humanity stood on a threshold, its feet still rooted in the hunter-gatherer past, but its eyes turned toward a new horizon. The changing climate did more than alter landscapes. It altered the human spirit. The awareness that the world could change, that life could be reshaped by the forces of time and temperature, awakened a deeper understanding of adaptation, foresight, and continuity. When the last remnants of the glaciers vanished and the Earth settled into its gentler climate, humankind had already begun to evolve not just biologically, but culturally. The Mesolithic Age was an interlude of transformation, a bridge between survival and civilization. The warmth that melted the ice also thawed the human imagination, preparing it for the next great leap. Out of the forests and along the riverbanks of this renewed world, people began to plant the seeds, both literal and symbolic, of the settled life to come. In the quiet centuries that followed the retreat of the great glaciers, the Earth entered a gentler age, and with it humanity found new ways to live. The vast herds of mammoth and reindeer that had once roamed the icy plains were gone, replaced by forests alive with birds and smaller game. Rivers swelled with fish, lakes shimmered with life, and wild grasses spread across the warming lands. It was in this changed world, the Mesolithic Age, that humans turned their skill and intelligence to new forms of subsistence. They learned to fish, to hunt smaller and quicker animals, and to gather the growing abundance of plants and grains that flourished in the softer climate. These changes did not arrive suddenly, nor did they alter the human spirit overnight, but over generations they reshaped the rhythm of life, deepening humanity's bond with the land and preparing the way for the great transformation that would follow, the birth of agriculture. The great hunts of the Paleolithic, when entire groups pursued mammoths and bison across open plains, were now memories fading into legend. In their place came a quieter, more intricate kind of hunting. The new forests that spread across Europe and Asia after the Ice Age were dense and tangled, and large herds could no longer range freely through them. Hunters had to adapt to an environment of trees, shadows, and swift, solitary prey. They began to stalk red deer, roe deer, wild boar, and hares, creatures that demanded patience and stealth rather than brute strength. To meet these challenges, they developed lighter and more precise weapons. Bows and arrows tipped with microliths, finely chipped flakes of flint small enough to be set into wooden or bone shafts. The bow itself was a quiet revolution. It allowed hunters to strike from a distance, unseen and unheard, in the dappled silence of the forest. Alongside these new tools came new strategies. Traps and snares replaced the great drives of the open plains. Hunters studied animal behavior with extraordinary attention, learning where deer came to drink, where birds nested, where fish spawned. They left fewer traces, moving like part of the landscape itself. In this patient and deliberate way, the Mesolithic hunter entered into a new kind of relationship with the world around him, less a conqueror than a participant in its rhythms. Fishing became one of the great skills of this era. The melting of the ice had filled the earth with water. Rivers, lakes, and marshlands lay everywhere, rich with fish, shellfish, and waterfowl. People learned to craft hooks from bone and antler, to weave nets from plant fibers, and to carve canoes and paddles from hollowed logs. They built fish traps along the shallows and used harpoons to strike salmon and pike. For the first time, water became a steady source of food, predictable and abundant. Fishing altered not only diet but lifestyle. Groups began to settle for longer periods along riverbanks and coastlines, establishing semi-permanent camps. There they dried fish, gathered reeds, and made tools from shells and bones. The rhythm of life followed the movement of the tides and the return of the spawning seasons. Gathering remained central to survival, but the variety of food available increased dramatically in the warmer climate. Women and men alike collected berries, nuts, roots, and mushrooms from the forests, as well as seeds and grains from wild grasses that grew in open meadows. Hazelnuts, acorns, and wild barley became staples in many regions. Some communities learned to grind these seeds into meal using flat stones, an early step toward the domestication of grain that would later transform human existence. The gathering of wild plants required a deep knowledge of the environment, an understanding of which plants healed and which harmed, which ripened first and which lasted through winter. It was an intimate and empirical knowledge, born of generations of observation and memory, and it gave rise to the first sense of humans as caretakers of the land. The shift from hunting large game to exploiting smaller animals and plants also changed the social fabric of human life. The great cooperative hunts of the Paleolithic had required large bands and elaborate coordination. In the Mesolithic world, smaller groups could survive on their own, for food was more evenly distributed and diverse. Families or small clans might move through familiar territories, returning to the same lakes, groves, and meadows year after year. Life became more local, more stable, and more predictable. The relationship between humans and landscape deepened into one of familiarity and attachment, a precursor to the settled communities of the Neolithic. Archaeological remains from Mesolithic sites reveal the traces of this more varied diet and lifestyle. Shell middens, heaps of discarded shells and bones, line ancient coasts, marking places where generations gathered to feast and trade. Hearths filled with fish bones and charred nuts speak of a people who understood how to extract nourishment from every part of their environment. The tools they left behind, harpoons, bone needles, grinding stones, tell the story of innovation born not from scarcity but from curiosity and adaptation. These were people who had learned to live in balance with the world's changing moods. In adapting to this new abundance, the Mesolithic peoples began, perhaps for the first time, to look forward rather than merely to endure. The collection of wild grains may have led to the observation that seeds scattered one season could sprout the next. The gathering of fruit and nuts taught them the cycles of growth and decay. Slowly, through practice and observation, the idea of tending rather than simply taking began to form. Though agriculture still lay far in the future, its shadow already stretched across the Mesolithic world. Yet for all its relative ease, this new way of life did not free humanity from the demands of nature. The hunter and the gatherer still followed the seasons, still depended on rain and sun, still faced hunger in lean times. But the balance had shifted. Humanity was learning not only to adapt to its surroundings but to shape them gently, to select, to nurture, to anticipate. The fishing net, the grinding stone, and the bow were more than tools of survival. They were instruments of transformation. In the quiet villages along ancient lakes and rivers, beneath the vast sky of a newly tempered earth, humankind entered a different rhythm of existence. The Ice Age hunters had lived by the pursuit of the moment, their world one of peril and motion. The Mesolithic people lived by cycles, by the returning seasons, by knowledge that deepened year by year. They learned that the earth could provide without violence, that patience could yield abundance. From this understanding, the seeds of civilization were sown, not yet cultivated, but waiting, as all living things do, for their time to grow. As the great ice sheets withdrew and the Mesolithic dawned, humankind entered an age of refinement. The harsh simplicity of the Paleolithic world, where crude hand axes and heavy blades had served the needs of survival, gave way to subtler demands. The earth had changed. Forests had spread where tundra once lay. Animals had grown smaller and swifter, and the rhythms of life required precision more than brute strength. Out of this transformation emerged one of the quiet marvels of human ingenuity, the microlith. These small, finely crafted stone tools represented not merely an evolution in technology but a profound shift in the relationship between humans and their environment. The microlith was a triumph of detail, a work of patience and skill measured in millimeters rather than inches. Where the tools of earlier ages had been large, blunt, and multipurpose, the microlith was delicate, specialized, and adaptable. Crafted from flint, chert, or obsidian. These tiny blades, often no longer than a thumb's joint, were shaped through an exacting process of flaking and retouching. The napper would strike narrow blades from a prepared core, then trim their edges with careful pressure to create sharp points, crescents, and triangles. Alone, a microlith was too small to serve as a weapon or implement, but when set into wood or bone with resin or sinew, it became part of a greater whole. The edge of a sickle, the barbs of an arrow, the teeth of a harpoon. This modular design reflected a new kind of intelligence, one that valued versatility, repair, and innovation. The rise of microlithic technology was born from adaptation. As the climate warmed, the large Ice Age beasts that had once been the center of human subsistence, mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, and giant deer, disappeared. In their place came smaller, quicker animals that demanded agility and accuracy in the hunt. To strike down a deer darting through dense forest or a bird taking flight from reeds required weapons that were light, flexible, and easily replaced. The bow and arrow, which came into widespread use during this period, found its perfect partner in the microlith. These tiny blades could be mounted along a shaft to create serrated edges, or fitted into arrowheads designed to pierce and tear. They turned the hunter's toolkit into an instrument of precision, allowing kills from a distance with minimal risk. But the microlith's significance extended far beyond hunting. It represented an intellectual leap, a new understanding of how tools could be constructed and maintained. Instead of shaping a single massive implement, people now conceived of tools as systems of parts, each replaceable and designed for a purpose. When an arrowhead broke, a single microlith could be replaced without remaking the entire weapon. This innovation not only saved labor but encouraged experimentation. Different shapes and arrangements could be tested, adjusted, and improved. In this modular way of thinking lay the seeds of future craftsmanship and even, in a distant sense, of engineering. Archaeological sites from Europe to Africa, from India to the Japanese archipelago, bear witness to this technological flowering. The Mesolithic toolkit became remarkably diverse. Composite arrows, fish hooks, scrapers, burins for carving bone and antler, sickle blades for cutting reeds and grasses. Some microliths were so small and finely worked that modern scholars can scarcely reproduce them without magnification. Others were set into wooden handles to form knives or used as spear tips for fishing and hunting waterfowl. The same innovation appeared across vast distances, suggesting either wide-ranging contact between groups or the parallel emergence of similar ideas, a testament to the universality of human adaptation. The making of microliths required not only technical skill but a deep familiarity with materials. Flint was prized for its sharpness and predictability, yet different stones demanded different strikes and pressures. The napper had to know the feel of the core, the direction of the grain, the force of each blow. This was craftsmanship at its most intimate, a dialogue between human hands and the hidden structure of stone. The sound of flint striking flint, the rhythm of shaping, the gleam of a new edge in the sunlight. These were the quiet music of the Mesolithic artisan. In every fragment of stone was contained both the memory of the hunt and the artistry of survival. The development of microliths also reflected broader changes in human life. With the retreat of the great herds and the spread of forests and rivers, communities grew smaller and more localized. Each group adapted its tools to the particular demands of its environment. Along the coasts, microliths were fashioned into barbed points for fishing and harpooning. In the forests, they became arrowheads and cutting blades. In the plains, they served as knives for processing hides and meat. This regional variation reveals the growing diversity of human cultures, a mosaic of techniques and traditions, each shaped by the land that sustained it. Beyond their practical uses, these small tools may have carried symbolic weight. The precision and care with which they were made suggest that their creation was not purely utilitarian. The knapping of stone, passed down through generations, likely held ritual or instructional value. Apprentices learned from masters, observing the subtle gestures that turned raw flint into gleaming bladelets. The act of creation itself, transforming inert stone into instruments of life, may have carried echoes of reverence. In the sharp edge of a microlith lay both the promise of food and the memory of danger, both life and death bound in a single stroke. Through the microlith, humanity achieved not only survival but mastery of subtlety. It marked a turning point from the brute force of early toolmaking to the finesse of craft. The hunter no longer stood apart from nature, armed with heavy clubs and crude blades. He moved within it, guided by knowledge, patience, and skill. Each tool became an extension of the mind as much as of the hand. And though the microlith was small, almost invisible beside the grander relics of later ages, it represented an intellectual revolution, a quiet sharpening of thought as well as stone. When we hold a microlith today, its edges dulled by time but its form still perfect, we touch the ghost of that revolution. It is a fragment of a vanished world, yet also a mirror of our enduring nature. The drive to refine, to perfect, to adapt. In its simplicity lies complexity, in its fragility, strength. The people who made these tools were not primitive in any sense we can easily imagine. They were craftsmen of necessity and vision, living at the edge of change. Their blades, though tiny, cut the path toward the future, toward the settled villages, the sickles of the Neolithic farmer, and the metal edges of civilization itself. The microlith was, in essence, the first whisper of modern human ingenuity, the spark of precision that illuminated the long dawn of human history. As the world warmed and the great glaciers of the Ice Age withdrew, humanity began to linger. The endless migrations that had defined the Paleolithic gave way to a quieter rhythm, a life not yet settled but no longer wholly nomadic. In the Mesolithic age, people discovered that the land could sustain them for more than a season, that rivers, forests, and meadows offered a steady abundance if one knew how to live in balance with them. From this discovery emerged one of the most profound changes in human history, the birth of the first temporary villages and semi-permanent shelters. They were modest clusters of huts, reed dwellings, or pit houses, but they marked the beginning of humanity's rootedness, the first attempts to claim a place in the landscape not as wanderers, but as residents. The shift was gradual, unfolding across generations. The melting of the ice had transformed the earth. Vast plains became forests. Rivers swelled with meltwater. Lakes formed in deep valleys carved by glaciers. Game grew smaller but more numerous. Fish filled the waterways, and edible plants spread across the fertile ground. Where once humans had followed herds across desolate steppes, they now found that they could remain near a river's bend, a sheltered bay, or a forest edge and still find all they needed. The Mesolithic hunter-gatherer learned to read the land as a permanent companion rather than a fleeting host. These early settlements were born of both opportunity and necessity. To fish, to gather, to hunt small game, and to process food required tools and storage that were difficult to carry endlessly. Families began to build structures that could withstand weather, that could be left and returned to with each season. Some shelters were little more than frameworks of branches covered with hides or thatch, domed like the curve of a ribcage. Others were dug into the earth, with low walls and roofs supported by wooden posts, insulated against wind and rain. Along lakes and rivers, people built dwellings of reeds and clay, using what the landscape provided. The ruins of such shelters, dark stains in the soil, post holes, hearths filled with ash, still whisper of their presence thousands of years later. In these small encampments, life began to organize itself differently. The group was no longer merely a band of wanderers chasing food, but a community anchored to a place. The rhythm of life became cyclical rather than linear. People returned to the same sites year after year, following the migrations of fish or the ripening of certain plants. A village might lie quiet through the winter, then stir with voices and smoke each spring as its inhabitants came back to harvest the bounty of the waters. Over time, these sites accumulated layers of human memory. Tools left behind, hearths rebuilt, new huts rising upon the remains of the old. Thus, the first hints of permanence entered the human world. Archaeological remains from this period, such as those at Starkar in England, Lepenski Vir on the Danube, or the Moglemosian sites of northern Europe, reveal how sophisticated these settlements could be. Floors were often laid with brushwood or bark to keep out dampness. Hearths were arranged carefully, sometimes encircled with stone. In some places, the layout of huts suggests a sense of order or planning, a communal awareness of space. At Lepenski Vir, the houses were built on trapezoidal foundations facing the river, as if the people who lived there had already begun to think of architecture not merely as shelter, but as a form of harmony with their surroundings. The development of semi-permanent dwellings also changed social life. When people stayed longer in one place, relationships deepened. Children grew up in familiar landscapes. The elderly could remain near their hearths. The dead might even be buried nearby, binding the living and the land through memory. With continuity came culture. Toolmaking workshops appeared within settlements, ornaments and carvings multiplied, and food preparation became more elaborate. Hearths were not only for cooking but for gathering. Places where stories were told, songs were sung, and knowledge passed down. Around these fires, the foundations of community were quietly laid. Yet this new way of living demanded new forms of cooperation. Permanent or semi-permanent camps required maintenance, protection, and division of labor. Someone had to repair roofs, someone to gather firewood, others to prepare hides or tend the young. The notion of shared responsibility, the idea that a place belonged to all who lived within it, began to take shape. This was the seed of social organization, the first faint outline of what would one day become the village, the town, the city. The permanence of settlement also affected the human perception of time. For the nomadic hunter, time was measured by movement, the chase, the season, the migration. For the inhabitant of a camp, time began to take on spatial dimensions. The growing of plants, the return of fish, the slow decay of the last season's shelters. The land itself became a calendar. This deeper awareness of cycles, of return and renewal, nurtured a more reflective kind of thought, a consciousness rooted not only in survival but in place. Still, These villages remained fragile, balanced between old habits and new possibilities. People did not yet farm the land or breed animals in any systematic way. They still moved when resources waned, dismantling their huts and carrying what they could. But each time they returned, the stay grew longer, the structures more enduring. What began as convenience evolved into attachment. Humans were beginning to feel something that their nomadic ancestors had scarcely known: a sense of home. The transition was not universal or uniform. In some regions, people remained fully mobile. In others, especially along coasts and rivers, they grew increasingly sedentary. The abundance of fish and plants in such areas encouraged longer occupation, and trade between groups may have begun to develop, exchanging shells, pigments, and stone tools. The idea of belonging to a place extended beyond the household to the wider landscape, binding groups through shared territory and memory. When one imagines these first villages, clusters of low huts beside a quiet lake, smoke rising at dusk, voices murmuring over the crackle of fire, it is not hard to see in them the beginnings of everything that followed. In those simple circles of shelter lay the human impulse to build, to return, to remain. The Mesolithic dwellers could not have known that they were inaugurating a revolution more enduring than any conquest, the domestication not of plants or animals, but of the human spirit itself. They learned, for the first time, that to live well was not always to move forward, but sometimes to stay. From their modest camps grew the idea of settlement, of continuity, and of civilization, the quiet architecture of belonging that still defines us today. In the long twilight between the wildness of the Paleolithic and the order of the Neolithic, humankind stood upon a threshold. The earth was changing, and so too were its inhabitants. The forests were thickening, the rivers swelling, the climate softening into a new gentleness. The people of the Mesolithic age had learned to fish, to hunt with precision, to dwell for seasons in the same places. Yet another, quieter transformation began to unfold, one that would alter not merely how humans lived, but how they perceived their place in the natural world. It was in this age that the first companionships with animals were forged and the first tentative experiments with the soil began. From these fragile beginnings emerged two of humanity's most enduring achievements: the domestication of the dog and the early attempts at farming. The bond between humans and dogs was the earliest and most intimate alliance ever formed between species. Its origins reach back into the late Paleolithic, but it was in the Mesolithic that this companionship became widespread and deeply integrated into daily life. Wolves had long shadowed human camps, drawn by the scent of food and the warmth of the fires. Perhaps the first steps toward domestication were mutual acts of caution and curiosity. The wolf lingering at the edge of the light, the human tossing scraps into the darkness. Over generations, a few of these animals drew closer. Those less fearful, more tolerant of people, found a place near the hearth. Those with gentler temperaments survived and bred. Slowly, through a process of selection more instinctive than deliberate, wolves transformed into dogs, smaller, tamer, and bound to humankind by an invisible thread of trust. For the Mesolithic hunter, the dog became both companion and tool. It was a partner in the hunt, its nose leading the way through forest and marsh, its senses attuned to scents and sounds imperceptible to humans. It could track wounded prey, warn of approaching danger, or guard sleeping children in the night. But beyond its usefulness, the dog was something new in the human experience. An animal that lived within the circle of the fire, that shared not only food but emotion. In its eyes, early humans found a reflection of loyalty and understanding unlike anything the wild had ever offered. This bond softened the boundaries between species, introducing the idea, still young and unspoken, that nature might be shaped not only by force, but by care. Archaeological evidence bears witness to the depth of this relationship. Burials from Mesolithic sites show dogs laid to rest beside humans, sometimes with adornments or food offerings, as if they too were members of the community. These graves speak of affection, of mourning, and perhaps of a belief in companionship beyond death. The domestication of the dog was thus not merely a practical development but a cultural one. It marked the birth of empathy across species, a recognition that partnership could exist between human and animal, a foreshadowing of the far greater domestications to come. Yet while one part of humanity's attention turned to animals, another began to turn toward the earth itself. The Mesolithic peoples, still hunters and gatherers, had become astute observers of the land's cycles. They knew when wild grains ripened, when fruits swelled, when roots fattened beneath the soil. Such knowledge, accumulated over generations, led to discovery. Somewhere, perhaps by accident, someone noticed that seeds dropped near a campsite sprouted anew the next season. The connection between seed and plant, between time and harvest, was not yet fully understood, but it awakened a new idea, that humans might not need to follow nature, but could coax it to follow them. In various corners of the world, from the Near East to the Indus Valley, from the Nile's banks to the gentle plains of Europe, these early experiments began. People began to scatter seeds of wild barley, wheat, or millet near their dwellings, sometimes tending the ground with simple digging sticks or hoes made from antler and bone. The first gardens were modest patches, half wild and half tended, where human intention mingled with natural chance. The yield was uncertain, the work slow, but the idea itself was revolutionary. For the first time, humans acted not merely as gatherers but as cultivators, altering the landscape with purpose. This early farming was not yet true agriculture. It was tentative, a seasonal supplement rather than a full transformation. Yet it required a new patience and a new sense of time. To plant was to think of the future, to imagine continuity, and to trust that labor would bring reward months later. It was a quiet act of faith, and it marked a turning point in human thought. The forager lived from day to day. The cultivator began to live in seasons. In the rhythm of sowing and harvest, humanity first sensed the passage of cyclical time, the continuity that would underpin later civilization. The practice of growing plants also encouraged a more settled way of life. Where crops were tended, people stayed longer. Where people stayed, they built sturdier shelters and stored more food. The seeds they planted outside their huts were mirrored by the roots they put down within their communities. Food surpluses, however small, allowed for new forms of craft and leisure, for reflection and social exchange. Slowly, imperceptibly, humanity was learning to live with the land rather than upon it. The domestication of dogs and the cultivation of plants were, in their essence, acts of taming, one of the animal world, the other of the plant world, but they were also acts of self-transformation. They taught humans restraint, foresight, and the value of partnership. They replaced the immediacy of the hunt with the slow reward of nurture. And in doing so, they began to reshape the emotional landscape of human life. The bond with the dog brought loyalty and companionship. The bond with the soil brought stability and hope. When the long ages of hunting and wandering drew to a close, the earth had already been remade. The great forests of the Mesolithic had matured, the rivers had carved their steady courses, and the climate had settled into its gentler modern rhythm. Out of this stability arose a transformation so profound that it would alter forever the relationship between humanity and the natural world. It was not a sudden change, not the work of a single generation, but a slow and cumulative awakening that spread across continents. This was the agricultural revolution, the quiet dawn of cultivation, the moment when people learned to grow the plants they once gathered and to tame the animals they once hunted. In that act of control, the rhythms of human life were rewritten. The first farmers were not visionaries but pragmatists, guided by the experience of countless seasons of observation. For millennia, their ancestors had gathered wild grains, scattered seeds, and noted where plants thrived best. Somewhere in the fertile valleys of the Near East, along the Tigris and Euphrates, the Levant, and the foothills of Anatolia, people began to cultivate the land deliberately. They cleared small patches of soil, sowed seeds of barley and wheat, and learned that the plants could be nurtured, protected, and multiplied. What began as an experiment in convenience soon became an act of dependence. Food that had once been found was now made, and the world itself became a vast field awaiting human care. Farming altered everything. No longer did families have to follow the migrations of game or the ripening of wild fruit. They could remain in one place, returning season after season to the same patch of ground. With the grain harvest came abundance, and with abundance came permanence. The first true villages took root, clusters of mud brick houses surrounded by fields of green. The tools of survival changed as well. Stone blades became sickles, digging sticks gave way to plows, and hand grinders wore smooth from the endless turning of grain into meal. The earth had become not only a source of sustenance but a canvas of human labor. Alongside the cultivation of crops came the domestication of animals. The wild goats and sheep that roamed the hills of the Near East proved adaptable to human companionship. At first, they were hunted and corralled, driven into enclosures to make the slaughter easier. But over generations, people began to keep them alive, breeding the gentler and more docile individuals. Cattle, too, were drawn from the wild herds, their strength harnessed for work, their milk and meat providing nourishment beyond the kill. The partnership between human and animal deepened with every generation. Where once the hunter's spear had defined the relationship, now it was the shepherd's crook and the herdsman's call. This domestication was not merely practical, it was emotional and symbolic. To tend animals required patience, care, and constancy. The rhythms of the herds became the rhythms of human life. Birth, growth, and death were witnessed daily, and from these cycles arose new forms of understanding. Ritual, gratitude, perhaps even the first intimations of ownership and loss. In every field and pen, humanity was learning both mastery and responsibility. The agricultural revolution reshaped the human body as much as it did the human mind. The diet of grains and domesticated meat changed health and longevity, while constant labor under the sun hardened muscles and stooped backs. The permanence of settlement demanded new forms of shelter and storage. Granaries were built to guard the harvest, walls to protect against raiders and wild beasts. The concept of property emerged, the idea that a piece of land, once cultivated, belonged to those who had worked it. Thus, from the seedbed of agriculture grew the roots of social hierarchy and possession. Wealth could now be measured not in the number of successful hunts, but in the size of a herd or the fullness of a storehouse. Communities multiplied, and with them came the need for cooperation and order. Irrigation channels had to be dug and maintained, harvests coordinated, disputes resolved. The shared labor of farming demanded stability, and stability bred governance. The first leaders may have been those who managed the grain or organized the work, their authority born not of conquest but of stewardship. From the management of crops and herds arose the first complex societies, the earliest stirrings of civilization. But beneath these visible changes lay something subtler, a transformation of the human spirit. The hunter had lived in a world of pursuit and uncertainty, his fate bound to the will of nature. The farmer, by contrast, lived by prediction and patience. He tilled the soil, planted the seed, waited through the long season, and trusted in the return of rain and sun. Hope became a daily companion. Faith, whether in nature, gods, or destiny, grew from the soil itself. The earth became a mirror of human order, its cycles mapped onto ritual and belief. Yet the new life carried its burdens. Settlement meant vulnerability to famine, to flood, to disease. The same animals that provided milk and labor also brought pestilence into human homes. Fields could fail, stores could rot. Dependence on the harvest was both liberation and bondage. The old freedom of the hunter, the mobility that had allowed escape from scarcity, was lost. In binding themselves to the land, humans had achieved stability at the cost of risk, abundance at the cost of freedom. Still, the transformation was irreversible. By the end of the Neolithic Age, vast regions of the world had embraced cultivation and herding. Villages grew into towns. Towns became centers of trade and culture. The domestication of plants and animals had set in motion a chain of consequences that would shape every age to come: population growth, social complexity, and the eventual rise of cities and states. To look back upon that first furrow cut into the earth, upon the first pen built for a flock, is to glimpse the true beginning of human civilization. The agricultural revolution was not a single event but a revelation, that life could be shaped, that nature could be guided by human will. The soil that once yielded wild grasses now answered to the hand of man, and the animals that once fled at his approach now lived at his side. In that act of domestication lay both promise and peril, the twin gifts of abundance and burden. From the seed and the herd, humanity learned the meaning of permanence. The Neolithic farmer, standing in his field at dawn, watching the mist rise over his crops and hearing the soft bleating of his flock, lived at the threshold of history. The world was no longer a wilderness to be endured, but a home to be cultivated. And in the turning of the seasons, he discovered both the fragility and the power of creation, the realization that, in mastering the earth, humankind had begun to master itself. The Neolithic world was a world of transformation. The great revolutions of farming and herding had already taken root, and humanity's hands had become the principal instruments of change. For the first time, people shaped not only the land but the very materials of their daily lives, turning earth, fiber, and stone into tools and art that reflected both necessity and imagination. In the quiet rhythm of settled villages, new crafts emerged: pottery, weaving, and the refinement of tools, and through them human life gained comfort, stability, and a growing sense of mastery over the material world. It began with the simple need to store the harvest. The early farmers of the Neolithic cultivated grains that had to be kept dry and safe from pests. Baskets and skin bags could serve for a time, but they were fragile and perishable. Somewhere, perhaps by accident, people discovered that clay hardened when exposed to heat. The soft mud of riverbanks, shaped by hand and left too close to the fire, turned firm and durable. From this discovery came one of humanity's most enduring inventions: pottery. What began as crude containers of sun-dried clay evolved into skillfully made vessels, fired in open hearths and later in kilns that reached greater heat. Each piece of pottery carried the mark of its maker's hands. The Neolithic potter learned to coil strips of clay, to smooth the surface with water and stone, to decorate it with impressions of cord or reed. Some vessels were purely practical: jars for storing grain, bowls for preparing food, pots for cooking over the hearth. But others bore patterns that spoke of thought and identity. Spirals, lines, and geometric shapes appeared as expressions of beauty or belief. In these designs, the human impulse to create merged with the routines of survival. Pottery was both art and necessity, a sign that daily life had become something more than the struggle to endure. The pot transformed the way people ate and lived. It allowed food to be cooked slowly, softening grains and tough meats, expanding the human diet. It made it possible to store surplus, to plan for lean seasons, to trade goods across distances. The presence of pottery marks a threshold in archaeology because it reveals a people who had learned to dwell within time, to prepare for the future, to think beyond the day's hunger. The hearth, once a place for simple fire, became a center of domestic life, surrounded by pots and tools that reflected care and permanence. As pottery shaped the household, weaving transformed the body and the home alike. The early farmers, who had domesticated sheep and grown flax, discovered that these materials could be twisted, spun, and woven into thread and cloth. What had once been the rough hides of hunted animals became the soft and durable fabrics of woven fiber. The first spindles and looms appeared, simple wooden frames upon which threads were stretched and interlaced with rhythmic precision. The sound of weaving, the patient motion of hands guiding thread through thread, became one of the defining sounds of Neolithic life. Weaving offered more than comfort. It offered identity. Patterns and colors became symbols of family, region, and tradition. The making of cloth required skill, time, and collaboration, often performed by women whose knowledge of fiber, dye, and texture was passed down through generations. It was a craft of intimacy and memory, linking the body to the home, the present to the past. Clothing became not only protection from the elements but an expression of belonging. In a world no longer transient, appearance and ornament acquired meaning. They reflected stability, prosperity, and social connection. With the rise of these crafts came the refinement of tools. The crude stone implements of earlier ages were replaced by polished and specialized instruments. Axes, sickles, and chisels were ground smooth, their edges sharper, their forms suited to specific tasks. The Neolithic craftsmen understood the qualities of stone, selecting fine-grained flint or jadeite, shaping it through hours of patient labor. The invention of grinding and polishing marked a leap in technology. These tools lasted longer, cut cleaner, and allowed for greater precision in building, carving, and farming. Better tools made possible the construction of permanent houses, the felling of larger trees, the clearing of land for fields. They were instruments not only of survival but of transformation. With each blow of a polished axe, forests gave way to settlements. With each stroke of a chisel, the raw materials of nature became the framework of human life. In their skill and persistence, Neolithic people forged the foundations of craftsmanship itself, a relationship between hand, material, and intention that would define civilization for millennia to come. These new technologies changed the rhythm of daily existence. The Neolithic home was no longer a temporary refuge, but a carefully organized space filled with tools, containers, and textiles. Inside, the fire burned steadily. Pots hung or rested near the hearth. Woven mats covered the floor, and baskets of seed awaited planting. Work was divided and specialized. Potters, weavers, and toolmakers each mastering their craft. Such specialization marked the beginning of social differentiation, the first faint outlines of economic exchange and community dependence. Yet within this growing complexity, there remained a quiet intimacy. Each object bore the trace of its maker's hand, each task the continuity of tradition. The shaping of clay, the spinning of thread, the polishing of stone. These were acts of patience and ritual, repeated endlessly yet always renewed. Through them, humans came to see their world as something that could be shaped, improved, and beautified. The crafts of the Neolithic were not only practical achievements. They were the first expressions of a consciousness rooted in creation rather than survival. The ease that pottery, weaving, and refined tools brought was not merely physical, it was psychological. For the first time, people lived with a measure of predictability and comfort. Their homes held warmth, their bodies were clothed, their food secure. The constant uncertainty of earlier ages gave way to a steadier, more contemplative life. In that newfound stability, imagination flourished. Art, ritual, and storytelling found fertile ground in communities no longer consumed by hunger or flight. By the close of the Neolithic Age, the crafts that had begun as humble necessities had become the cornerstones of culture. Pottery carried not only grain but the memory of ancestors. Woven cloth embodied beauty as well as function. Tools served not only labor but artistry. Together, they defined the human capacity to transform raw matter into meaning. The story of these inventions is not merely the tale of technological progress, but of awakening sensibility. In the soft curve of a clay vessel, in the interlaced threads of woven cloth, in the polished sheen of a stone blade, humanity first glimpsed its own reflection, a being no longer shaped by the world, but capable of shaping it. And in that quiet mastery, life itself became an art. As the Neolithic Age matured, the scattered fields and clustered huts of the first farming communities began to give rise to something more intricate than mere settlement. Humanity, long bound by kinship and the simple cooperation of survival, entered a new stage of organization. The steady rhythm of agriculture, the growth of herds, and the flourishing of crafts made life more secure, and with security came complexity. People no longer lived only as families bound by blood, but as communities bound by work, exchange, and responsibility. Out of this quiet transformation arose the first social structures, the division of labor, and the beginnings of trade, developments that would shape the human world into societies recognizable even today. In the early villages that dotted river valleys and fertile plains, life had ceased to revolve entirely around the hunt. Fields needed tending, animals required care, tools had to be made and repaired, homes maintained, and goods exchanged. The tasks of survival diversified, and with that diversity came specialization. No longer did every person perform every task. Rather, skill and aptitude began to define an individual's role within the group. One man might become a skilled flint knapper, another a potter or builder. One woman might excel in weaving, another in food preservation or the tending of gardens. Over time, these roles deepened into identities, passed down through generations. The Neolithic world had begun to discover the power of organized labor. The division of labor did more than increase efficiency. It created interdependence. The farmer who grew grain relied on the potter to provide vessels for storage. The weaver who crafted cloth depended on the herder for wool. The toolmaker needed the miner to bring stone or metal from the earth. Each person's work gained meaning through the work of others. In this intricate web of production, the first faint outlines of economy emerged. Work was no longer a solitary struggle against nature but a collective enterprise, linking every household to the well-being of the community. With specialization came skill, and with skill came pride and differentiation. The craftsman who shaped fine pottery or polished stone tools to perfection held a status distinct from the common laborer. Knowledge of materials, of technique, of the rhythms of nature became a source of respect and influence. In many villages, certain individuals came to hold authority, not through physical power alone, but through their mastery of essential crafts or their ability to manage the surplus of food and goods. Leadership, once born of strength and hunting prowess, now emerged from wisdom, foresight, and organization. Thus, the foundations of hierarchy were laid. The growth of surplus was the true catalyst for change. Farming produced more food than a single family could consume, and herding created stores of meat, milk, and hides. Pottery allowed grain to be stored through the winter. Weaving and toolmaking produced goods of lasting value. These surpluses made possible the first exchanges beyond immediate need. Villages began to trade, first with neighboring settlements, later across greater distances. Along riverbanks and mountain passes, people carried baskets of grain, jars of oil, woven cloth, polished axes, and beads of shell or stone. The act of exchange gave rise to relationships between communities, creating networks of contact that spread ideas, technologies, and beliefs. Trade did not merely enrich material life, it transformed the imagination. It taught people that the world extended beyond the boundaries of their valley or plain, that others lived differently, valued different things, spoke in different tongues. The meeting of traders at seasonal gatherings or on shared routes was one of the earliest forms of diplomacy, a precursor to markets and commerce. In the exchange of goods, trust was born, and from trust came laws, promises, and agreements. Humanity was beginning to weave the fabric of society that would one day bind cities and nations. As these networks expanded, so too did inequality. The control of surplus, whether of food, animals, or crafted goods, conferred power. Those who managed the granaries or directed the work of others began to occupy privileged positions. Some families accumulated wealth, measured not in coins but in cattle, land, or stored grain. Others labored in service, their hands tied to the cycles of planting and harvest. The seeds of social stratification had been sown. Though small and subtle at first, these distinctions deepened over generations, laying the groundwork for classes and hierarchies that would define the Bronze Age and beyond. The rise of trade and division of labor also gave new meaning to community itself. The village was no longer merely a collection of dwellings but an organism, a living structure sustained by cooperation, exchange, and shared purpose. Rituals and customs developed to preserve this balance. Festivals to celebrate the harvest, councils to resolve disputes, ceremonies to honor those whose work sustained the whole. The organization of labor became intertwined with the organization of belief. The gods, once spirits of hunt and storm, now became guardians of fertility, of craft, of trade. The sacred and the social were no longer separate. Both were woven into the fabric of daily work. In these early communities, one can glimpse the first signs of the world to come. The merchant's path, the artisan's workshop, the farmer's field, the leader's hall. Yet despite the hierarchy and complexity that emerged, there remained a deep sense of mutual dependence. Every role, however humble, contributed to the survival of the group. The weaver and the potter were as vital as the herdsman and the farmer. Cooperation was not merely a virtue, it was a necessity born of settled life. The Neolithic Age was thus the cradle of social order. Out of the soil that yielded grain and the hands that shaped clay arose the first societies governed by structure rather than chance. Humanity had learned to divide its labor, to trade its goods, to organize its life. The cost was the loss of equality and simplicity. The reward was prosperity and continuity. The village became the prototype of civilization, its routines the rhythm of human destiny. In the stillness of the Neolithic dawn, as smoke rose from hearths and voices mingled over fields of ripening wheat, a new kind of life had taken shape, a life bound not by blood alone but by work, exchange, and shared destiny. Humanity had ceased to live merely in nature and had begun, for the first time, to live in society. And from that moment onward, history itself began to gather momentum, driven by the ceaseless interplay of labor, trade, and the ever-deepening structures of human community. As the Neolithic world matured, human life, once bound to the immediate demands of hunger and survival, grew rich with reflection. The steady rhythm of farming, the cycle of seasons, and the patterns of life and death in settled communities awakened a new awareness of the unseen. For the first time, people began to look beyond the tangible world of soil and stone toward something greater, something eternal. Out of this awakening emerged the earliest forms of religion, woven deeply into the daily fabric of existence. The same hands that shaped clay vessels and tilled the fields now raised stones toward the sky. In their monuments, rituals, and beliefs, the people of the Neolithic Age sought to understand their place in the vast, mysterious order of life. The farmer lived by the pulse of the earth. He saw how the seed, buried in darkness, rose into light, how rain and sun governed the harvest, how the turning of seasons brought death and renewal. These natural rhythms shaped his understanding of the sacred. The gods of the Neolithic were not distant rulers but living forces within nature itself. The sun that warmed the fields, the earth that yielded grain, the moon that guided the tides and the growth of crops. To live was to participate in this eternal cycle, and religion became the means of harmony between humankind and the unseen powers that sustained it. Archaeological traces suggest that many Neolithic peoples practiced fertility cults and earth-centered worship. Clay figurines of women with exaggerated forms, broad hips, full breasts, and rounded bellies have been found in countless sites from Anatolia to the Danube, from the Mediterranean to the Industry. These mother goddess figures, though varied in form, express a common reverence for fertility, for the mysterious power of birth and renewal. The earth itself was seen as a living mother, her body the soil that nourished all things. Planting a seed became a sacred act, a symbolic union of death and rebirth. Every harvest was both sustenance and miracle. With the domestication of animals, new sacred relationships emerged. Herding taught humans the fragility of life and the responsibility of care. Animals became companions, providers, and sometimes symbols of divine power. The bull, strong and enduring, appeared in early rituals as an emblem of virility and strength. The ram and goat, bound to fertility and sacrifice, occupied sacred roles in emerging mythologies. To offer an animal to the gods was not merely to seek favor, but to participate in the eternal exchange between life and death, a gesture of gratitude to the powers that governed existence. As these beliefs deepened, they found expression in monumental form. Across Europe and beyond, people began to raise great stones in patterns that defied mere practicality. From Brittany to the British Isles, from Malta to the Mediterranean, vast circles, dolmens, and passage graves were built. Megalithic monuments that required planning, cooperation, and a shared purpose beyond daily survival. These structures stand even now as witnesses to an age when religion, astronomy, and community were bound together. Stonehenge, perhaps the most famous of these monuments, rises from the plain of southern England like a frozen ritual in stone. Built and rebuilt over centuries, its massive uprights and lintels align with the movements of the sun, the midsummer sunrise, the midwinter sunset. It was not merely a temple, nor only an observatory, but both, a place where the sacred and the celestial met. Here, at the turning points of the year, people gathered to mark the passage of time, to honor the forces that govern their existence, to remember the dead and celebrate the living. Similar monuments, such as the Passage Tomb at Newgrange in Ireland or the Great Stone Alignments of Karnak in France, reflect the same preoccupation with the cycles of the heavens. The rising and setting of the sun, the path of the stars, the changing light of the moon, these became the language of the divine. The builders of these monuments were not mere laborers but visionaries of time and order. They read in the sky a reflection of the earth's fertility and the soul's journey, and they expressed that vision through enduring stone. Religion in the Neolithic age was thus inseparable from community. It was not the solitary faith of the mystic, but the collective reverence of a people bound together by shared labor and shared hope. The construction of megalithic monuments demanded cooperation on an unprecedented scale. Entire villages would have worked for years to transport and raise the stones, guided by leaders, craftsmen, and priests. The act of building was itself a ritual, a physical manifestation of unity and purpose. In raising these stones, people also raised themselves, forging identity through sacred collaboration. Death, too, found new meaning in this spiritual world. The dead were no longer left to the wild, but were buried with care and ceremony. Tombs were built of stone and earth, often aligned with the sun or stars, as if to guide the departed toward another realm. Grave goods, tools, ornaments, food, and figurines were placed beside the bodies, signs of belief in an afterlife or in the continuity of existence beyond the grave. The ancestors became part of the living world, protectors of the land and its people. To honor them was to preserve the balance between past and present, between the visible and the invisible. In these practices, the essence of religion emerged, not as dogma, but as a shared language of awe. The Neolithic peoples lived close to the pulse of nature, and their faith reflected both humility and wonder. The monumental stones they raised were not merely temples to gods but mirrors of the cosmos, expressions of a truth they had begun to perceive: that human life, fleeting and fragile, was part of a larger, eternal pattern. The dawn light still touches the stones of ancient monuments, casting long shadows across fields once tilled by Neolithic hands. Though their builders are long vanished, their vision endures. In clay figurines, in sacred enclosures, in circles of stone aligned with the heavens, we see the first great flowering of the human spirit, the moment when mankind ceased to live only by the body and began to live also by the soul. Religion and monument, faith and stone, became the twin pillars of meaning, standing at the threshold of history. And from them would rise all the sacred architecture, all the myth and worship, all the longing for eternity that has accompanied humanity ever since.